I'd just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event.
Princess Anne had faced family scandals, constitutional emergencies, and private betrayals without letting her expression crack. But when a sealed investigation file was placed before her inside Windsor Castle, the Princess Royal suddenly stopped turning the pages. The review reportedly contained hidden household payments, unexplained private expenses, and a spending trail linked to Queen Camilla's senior office. Anne said nothing. She stared at one figure on the final page and realized the crisis had already reached the king. Before we reveal what this could mean for the royal family, subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had expected messy accounts or careless approvals, but the figures raised far more serious questions. The internal review had begun as a routine comparison of private royal costs and approved palace allowances. Instead, it appeared to show that money had been redirected through hospitality, residential maintenance, personal staffing, and family-related expenses that were never clearly presented to the Finance Committee. The same authorization codes appeared repeatedly, each connected to aides close to the Queen Consort. Anne pushed back her chair and stood with one hand pressed against the file. She had spent decades protecting the monarchy from the damage caused when privilege escaped scrutiny. If the records were accurate, this was not simply careless spending, it was a threat to public trust. Charles entered moments later and immediately noticed his sister's silence. He asked whether Camilla knew the investigation had concluded. Anne looked directly at him and answered, "Yes." When the king reached for the report, she kept her hand on the final page. A confidential appendix allegedly showed that several large expenses had been divided into smaller payments, keeping each transaction below the level that normally triggered additional review. That detail changed everything. It suggested that someone understood the palace safeguards and knew how to move around them. Anne then showed Charles the most troubling entry. Money listed as official royal maintenance had reportedly been spent on a private property used by members of Camilla's extended household. Charles read the address twice. His face tightened as Anne pointed to a handwritten authorization code beside the payment. Only one person in the Queen's household could explain how it had been approved. Yet the figures alone could not explain the deeper betrayal. Behind the disputed payments stood a royal family already divided by loyalty, pride, and years of buried resentment. Princess Anne believed restraint was essential to royal survival. Camilla viewed her household as a private sanctuary she had fought for decades to secure. Charles stood between them, forced to decide whether protecting his wife could damage the crown he had waited a lifetime to inherit. Anne had always treated privilege as an obligation rather than a reward. She accepted demanding schedules, avoided unnecessary comfort, and measured royal service through discipline. That reputation mattered because she was not examining ordinary private accounts. She was defending confidence in the monarchy. Camilla's experience had been very different. Years of public hostility had taught her to guard her privacy and trust only a small circle. After becoming queen, she built a loyal household that controlled access, protected her relatives, and shielded her from constant judgment. To Camilla, those aides were more than employees. They were her line of defense. Camilla received the message alone. The financial report had reached Anne. She read it twice, placed her phone face down, and calmly dismissed her aide. Only after the door closed did her hands begin to tremble. She knew the inquiry might expose mistakes, but she feared it could also make old accusations appear believable again. Charles approached Anne before the next briefing and asked her not to treat every questionable payment as proof of deliberate deception. He argued that royal household systems were complicated and staff sometimes made decisions under pressure. Anne listened, then reminded him that intention did not erase responsibility. The investigation reportedly showed that Camilla had not personally signed every transaction. However, meeting notes suggested that several payments were approved through verbal authority she had granted during private discussions. Anne also learned that Camilla's senior household manager had repeatedly used the Queen's name to shut down financial objections. William was informed during a confidential briefing. He became tense and asked whether money intended for engagements involving Catherine and their children had been redirected. No one answered immediately, and that silence said plenty. The unanswered question led back to a private royal dinner held months earlier. The gathering had been arranged to discuss charitable priorities, but before the final guests left, one of Camilla's aides presented a maintenance request for a property that was not listed as an official crown residence. Charles had invited Camilla, Anne, and William to Clarence House for a quiet discussion about the monarchy's reduced working schedule. No senior advisors were present, meaning every decision made in the room depended on personal trust. As the meeting ended, Camilla's household manager entered with an approval request. He described the proposed work as urgent security and restoration connected to the Queen's private accommodation. His tone was calm, but Anne immediately recognized the address. The property was regularly used by Camilla's relatives. Because it was not an official royal residence, the Crown had no automatic duty to pay for its upkeep. Anne asked why palace funds were involved. Camilla replied that her relatives faced security concerns because of her royal position, insisting that the work involved protection rather than private comfort. Anne answered that personal vulnerability did not automatically create a public financial obligation. Charles tried to cool the situation, promising that the expense would be reviewed later. Anne warned that delaying scrutiny could make any later explanation look like concealment. 2 days later, the payment was approved anyway. It no longer appeared under maintenance. Instead, it had been moved into a category called Temporary Household Operational Support, a broad label used for short-term costs connected to royal work. Anne understood the move immediately. The wording had changed, but the purpose appeared to be the same. She instructed a trusted auditor to examine related payments from the previous 18 months. The search reportedly uncovered costs connected to staffing, transport, private entertainment, and properties outside normal palace control. When the first summary arrived, Anne locked her office door, removed her glasses, and circled one authorization code. It led directly to Camilla's senior household office. The dinner table disagreement had now become something much more serious. When Anne finally confronted the Queen consort, neither woman could hide behind polite royal language. There were no courtiers, photographers, or advisors inside the private Windsor sitting room. Camilla waited near the fireplace, looking composed while gripping the back of a chair. Anne entered with the investigation file beneath one arm, placed it between them, and asked whether Camilla had knowingly allowed her household to present private spending as royal expenditure. Camilla's answer did not calm the crisis. It pushed the confrontation into dangerous territory. Charles had hoped the women could settle the dispute before the Royal Finance Council became involved. Once the council stepped in, the matter would no longer be a private family argument. It would become a formal financial crisis. Anne had arrived with marked pages covering the countryside property, entertainment bills, and additional staffing allowances that had allegedly escaped normal review. Camilla came without advisors because she refused to be questioned in front of palace staff. Now the two women stood face to face, with the disputed accounts between them and Charles waiting nearby. What happened next could decide whether this remained an internal royal dispute or became a scandal the palace could no longer contain. The Queen consort wanted control of the conversation. The Princess Royal wanted answers. Camilla listened until Anne began reading the disputed figures aloud, then interrupted. She said years of pressure, threats, and public hatred had been reduced to cold numbers on a page. Her voice shook, but her anger stayed sharp. Camilla accused the king's sister of never understanding what it meant to enter the monarchy while millions waited for her to fail. Anne did not back down. She said hardship might explain personal choices, but it could never excuse secret accounting. The issue was no longer comfort, it was trust. Camilla pushed the file away and insisted she had trusted her household to handle legitimate needs. She denied ordering anyone to hide payments. Anne slid the report back and asked why financial officers had been overruled using the Queen's name. Camilla's silence weakened her defense. She finally admitted giving verbal permission for flexibility when urgent costs appeared. However, she denied instructing aides to divide payments or conceal their purpose. Anne then opened a recorded meeting note containing Camilla's demand that one disputed expense be settled without another humiliating committee discussion. Her own words had become evidence. Charles entered after hearing raised voices. He found his wife close to tears and his sister standing rigidly beside the table. The king defended neither woman. Instead, he announced that control of the disputed budget would be removed from Camilla's office until investigators discovered who had manipulated the system. His intervention did not end the struggle. It shifted power toward the royal, whose next decision could protect Camilla or permanently weaken her authority. Charles had spent years defending his wife from judgment outside the palace. Now the greatest threat came from documents produced inside his own household. Sitting alone with the report, the monarch faced a brutal choice: protect the woman he loved or prove that no royal stood above accountability. When Charles finally picked up his pen, the order he signed changed the internal balance of the monarchy in one move. Charles held ultimate authority as sovereign, but royal money moved through trustees, officials, and separate public and private accounts. That structure mattered because one signature could not erase the wider system. The king had not approved the alleged hidden spending, but his reluctance to challenge Camilla's office had allowed it to become unusually independent. Late that evening, Charles read the confidential appendix alone. When he reached the section describing large payments divided into smaller amounts, he removed his glasses and placed them beside the file. For several minutes, he did not move. Charles feared what punishment might do to Camilla. Public humiliation could reopen wounds she had carried for years and reduce her position as queen to another scandal. Yet protecting her now could destroy Anne's trust and strengthen the belief that royal rules changed whenever the family felt threatened. William entered without a prepared speech. He told Charles that private forgiveness belonged inside a marriage, but official concealment would belong to history. The future king did not demand punishment. He demanded a clean separation between love and duty. Charles returned to the report and found the detail that broke his final resistance. Camilla's household manager had reportedly received broad spending freedom after arguing that repeated approval requests caused the queen distress. Another official had warned the king's private secretary months earlier, but the concern was downgraded to avoid conflict between royal households. That choice had protected temporary peace. It has also allowed the problem to grow. Charles signed an order freezing discretionary spending controlled by Camilla's senior office. All future payments would be reviewed by a temporary panel chaired by Anne, while an independent financial expert monitored every approval. News of the decision moved through the palace before dawn. Events were canceled, payments were suspended, and staff began preparing resignations. Camilla received the notice and realized that the household she had built for protection was starting to collapse. The first consequence arrived before breakfast when a senior aide resigned. Staff members were ordered to surrender access to financial systems, while private events and non-essential expenses were placed on hold. Queen Camilla watched her household fall into fearful silence. For years, those rooms had protected her from public judgment. Now every closed door felt like an accusation, and people who had once acted in her name were beginning to protect themselves. Charles's order covered private hospitality, additional travel, renovation work, and flexible staffing arrangements. Those funds had once moved with little resistance. Now every payment required outside approval, and previous decisions were being examined for signs that personal comfort had been placed above royal duty. Camilla learned about her household manager's resignation while preparing for an official engagement. She dismissed her dresser, removed the brooch she had planned to wear, and sat alone. The aide had repeatedly assured her that every arrangement was lawful. His sudden exit felt less like a resignation and more like abandonment. She also understood how the departure might appear to the public. A senior official leaving during an investigation could look like guilt before any final conclusion had been reached. Camilla had spent years rebuilding her position, and now one resignation threatened to tear that work apart. Anne felt no sense of victory. She said accountability required testimony, not disappearance, and ordered officials to preserve all emails, notes, and written instructions. She wanted evidence, not an easy scapegoat. The departing manager left behind a formal statement. He claimed Camilla knew the general purpose of the spending, but had never been shown the methods used to obtain approval. Auditors then discovered a troubling split. Some expenses benefited the Queen directly, while others were created by staff trying to anticipate her wishes without clear orders. Charles delivered the next blow himself. He canceled a private reception planned through Camilla's office and told her that no event could continue until the accounts were cleared. She asked whether he believed she had ordered the deception. Charles replied that belief no longer mattered without proof. That evening, Camilla sent Anne a private request. She wanted a meeting without advisors or a formal record. This time, the Queen was not preparing another defense. She was ready to admit what fear had caused her to ignore. Camilla entered the room alone. No secretary followed her, and she carried no folder. Anne expected another denial, or perhaps a demand that the investigation be softened. Instead, Camilla admitted that she knew her household had been spending too freely. She said she had not understood every transaction, but she had stopped asking questions because the answers made her feel exposed. For the first time, Anne saw fear across the table rather than open defiance. The meeting took place in a small room at Clarence House without aides, lawyers, or household officials. The investigation had already shown how the disputed money moved. What remained unclear was how much Camilla personally understood. Anne agreed to listen because responsibility could not be measured through figures alone. It depended on what the Queen knew, what she ignored, and why she chose to remain silent. Camilla spoke carefully. She admitted resisting repeated financial reviews because every challenge felt like another reminder that some people still believed she did not belong inside the monarchy. Her fear had not created every questionable payment, but it had allowed her closest aides to operate without enough scrutiny. And now that silence had come back with a vengeance. The Queen Consort had spent years fighting for acceptance, and she had begun treating scrutiny as another form of rejection. Anne did not soften. She warned that insecurity became dangerous when it encouraged silence. Trust could survive an honest mistake, but not a system built to prevent uncomfortable questions. Camilla lowered her eyes because she understood the difference. She reached into her handbag, removed a handwritten list, and placed it between them. It identified the expenses she was prepared to repay personally, including family hospitality, private staffing, and costs connected to the countryside property. The confession went deeper. Camilla revealed that she had confronted her household manager weeks earlier after discovering an inflated staffing bill. He assured her that the figures were justified, and she accepted his explanation instead of informing Charles. She also admitted telling staff to avoid embarrassing delays. Ambitious aides had apparently treated those words as permission to bypass safeguards. Anne offered no easy forgiveness. She proposed full repayment, permanent oversight, the removal of responsible officials, and a direct acknowledgement to the king. Camilla quietly agreed. Before leaving, Camilla asked whether Anne believed the monarchy could forgive weakness. The Princess Royal replied that forgiveness could begin only after responsibility had been accepted. Their private agreement gave the palace a way forward, but outside the gates, the story was already breaking. By sunrise, news of the household spending investigation had escaped the palace. Broadcasters interrupted morning programs, commentators questioned royal accountability, and crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. One newspaper captured the mood with a photograph of Anne leaving Windsor and 5 enormous words, "The princess who said no." In that moment, the scandal became a test of the crown. The palace confirmed that discretionary spending inside Camilla's household had been frozen until the financial review was completed. Officials stressed that the inquiry concerned specific household costs, not the monarchy's entire financial system. Public anger was already moving faster than the official explanation. Some demanded severe punishment, arguing that royal privilege had protected those closest to power. Others believed Camilla had been failed by aides who used vague verbal authority to approve payments she never fully understood. Outside Buckingham Palace, one woman held a sign reading, "Duty means everyone." Others applauded when Anne's role was mentioned. The Princess Royal became a symbol of accountability, but she felt no victory. Camilla watched the coverage alone. She saw decades of public rehabilitation reduced to one financial controversy. When a commentator questioned whether she deserved continued spending independence, she switched off the television. The room became silent, but the humiliation remained. Anne told William that the investigation was supposed to restore discipline, not create a winner and a villain. William agreed, but he knew public confidence required a clear response. He later supported the reforms without attacking Camilla, describing responsible stewardship as essential to royal trust. The palace announced that Camilla would repay every expense identified as private. Staff members accused of splitting or disguising payments would permanently lose financial authority. Charles also approved a rule requiring separate written authorization whenever royal money could benefit a relative or privately used property. The public had received accountability, but not a final verdict. Charles summoned Anne and Camilla for one last meeting where repayment, responsibility, and the Queen's future authority would be settled. Camilla's fate would not be decided by the shouting outside. It would be decided inside by 3 family members choosing between pride, punishment, and trust. The final meeting contained no raised voices. Charles sat between his wife and sister as the repayment order was placed on the table. Camilla signed first, Anne signed the oversight reform second, and the king added his name last. The final review concluded that Camilla had allowed an excessively secretive spending culture to develop. However, it found that she had not personally created the methods used to divide payments or disguise their purpose. Senior staff members who manipulated accounting categories were dismissed, while officials who ignored earlier warnings faced disciplinary action. Camilla accepted responsibility for all private and family-related costs identified by the audit, and agreed to repay the money from her personal funds. She also surrendered independent control over discretionary household spending. Flexible expenses involving hospitality, travel, and private staffing would now require outside approval. This was not a symbolic warning, it was a major reduction of her household power. Camilla admitted in a documented statement that fear had guided too many of her choices. Every question had felt like humiliation, and every financial review had seemed like proof that she still did not belong. Charles accepted her apology, but made one point crystal clear. Affection would never again be allowed to weaken financial safeguards. Anne rejected every attempt to describe the outcome as her personal victory. She had not frozen Camilla's spending to defeat her. She had stopped a system that had become dangerous. During a quiet exchange, Anne told Camilla that protecting the monarchy sometimes meant standing against the people closest to it. Charles then approved the final reform. A unified Royal Expenditure Council would oversee the households of the King, Queen, Prince of Wales, and every senior working royal. The Permanent Council would apply the same financial rules to everyone, regardless of title or family position. Camilla returned to official duties with reduced household authority. Her first engagement was subdued, but she carried it out without complaint. The Queen understood that trust would not return through ceremony, rank, or sympathy. It would return through discipline. The investigation destroyed neither her position nor Anne's compassion, but it forced both women to face the danger of unchecked loyalty. One had protected her household too fiercely. The other had protected the crown by refusing to look away. The file was closed, the money was returned, and the royal household was rebuilt under tighter control. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more royal stories and tell us in the comments, did Princess Anne make the right decision?